I have a couple of announcements before we start. We didn't really have a ticket collector tonight, so if you still have to turn in your fee for the evening, please find Karen either at dinner time or at the end. Tonight, we are going to welcome some guests from the past. Before they tell their life stories and their conversations, I want to give you a little historical context. At the beginning of the 1600s, the major centers of world cultures and civilization were on a par with each other in terms of power and technical development. The scientific revolution in Europe, with its new thinking, led to the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on logic and progress. Along with the desire to increase production for the transatlantic slave trade, they continued to develop new technology, and the Industrial Revolution, which strengthened Europe both economically, especially encouraging the development of capitalism, and militarily, allowed it to conquer or influence the Americas, Africa, and Asia, and to create empires and colonies, both direct and indirect. Eventually, those colonies sought and mostly achieved independence, but often the European powers retained strong economic influence over them. Meanwhile, wars over power and religion gave monarchs an excuse to seize power and argue for absolutism. Although the middle class often supported these rulers at first, eventually the bourgeoisie began to revolt against them in liberal revolutions, especially in England, America, and France. These revolutions claimed to seek liberty, equality, and fraternity for all people, along with representative democratic government. Lower classes, especially factory workers, but also farmers, eventually sought rights through socialist communist revolutions and reforms, sometimes inspired by anarchism, sometimes by Marxism. Western Europe mostly succeeded in crushing or compromising with them. Russia and China, at the time less industrialized, more agricultural countries, overthrew their monarchies only to replace them with dictatorships claiming to represent the people. Romanticism, meanwhile, emphasizing emotion and nature, reacted to Enlightenment classicism and influenced philosophy and the arts, but also politics. It gave rise to an emotional attachment to one's homeland and people. Nationalism contributed to more conflict and revolution, as people within multi-ethnic empires sought to break away from them and form independent nations, while other groups that had been divided among many such empires sought to unite into new large countries. With these issues of industry, capitalism, imperialism, reform, and tribal nationalism as background, the world wars of the 20th century broke out, ultimately weakening or dissolving many imperial powers, but also simply shifting some of them. America and the Soviet Union, especially along with China, rose as the new competing centers of power in a Cold War. One element of its competition was expressed in the space race, but also in ongoing nuclear proliferation. This rivalry ended the Soviet Union, but new tensions rose between and among new and old states. In addition, the Industrial Revolution continued to develop new technologies at an ever faster pace, with positive impact on the living standards of many people and increasingly negative impact on the environment and climate, while at the same time leading to the information revolution, to which we now adjust. Democracy again faces threats from authoritarian leaders seeking to undermine it, and its supporters must be vigilant. Tonight we have the opportunity to hear from characters representing various views along this span of events and ideas. We will first hear each of their life stories, then gather our dinners, then return to hear their discussion among each other, and finally have a chance to ask them questions about their thoughts and lives. Suggested questions are in your program along with the biography of each character. Please note well, the ideas expressed are intended to be those of the character represented, not necessarily of the student who researched them. In fact, sometimes those ideas are even repugnant to the actor. Do not confuse the student and the character.
Salve. My name is Johannes Kepler. I was born in the free imperial city of Hillside on Thursday, December 27, 1571, at roughly 2:30 in the morning. I am God's apt contemplator, who thoroughly understands his divine plans. I was born to investigate the skies and convey the meaning of the heavens to all humanity. I was raised in a Lutheran household in a religiously free city. My home of Hillside was in the midst of the patchwork of city-states that was Germany, and in turn, Germany was part of the Holy Roman Empire. My parents were both temperamental, causing my upbringing to be chaotic. My lifelong search for harmony in the universe was, at least in part, a reaction against this total lack of harmony in my childhood. My father would often leave to fight in some Protestant war, and one day he simply did not return. Despite the turmoil of my household and frequent moves, I still managed to attend school. I was frequently sick and socially struggled with the other boys, but I excelled academically. I quickly rose through my classes and outshined all the other boys. In 1589, I was recognized and won a spot in the prestigious University of Turing. For the previous 6 years of schooling, I had been aspiring to become a Lutheran clergyman, the highest position any young man could aspire to. However, at Turing, I followed attentively the instruction of my mathematics and astronomy professor, the famous Michael Mastel, and under his tutelage, I perceived how clumsy in many respects the hitherto customary notion of the structure of the universe was. As he taught me the ways of the Copernican model, it made sense to me. The sun is the most glorious of God's creations. It is the center of the universe. Why would he not put it here? I publicly declared these thoughts on the Copernican system. Because of this belief and my inability to not speak my mind, Turing decided to make sure that I did not become a clergyman. Moreover, I had already begun to question some tenets of the faith. I was sent to Graz to become the district mathematician and mathematics teacher. However, I quickly showed that I was not meant to be a teacher, and no one attended my classes. This left much time to do my job as the district mathematician, where I vigorously applied myself to my studies. Part of my job included writing horoscopes. To me, this was nourishing the superstition of fatheads. However, it was expected. My first horoscopes even turned out exactly as I had predicted them. This gave me instant renown as an astrologist and mathematician. During my time in Graz, I published my first book, Mysterium Cosmographicum, The Mysteries of the Universe. The Danish astronomer, Tycho Braun, noticed it, and he invited me to work for him. Tycho was a great observer and record keeper. His records were the most accurate of the time, and I was ecstatic at the opportunity to meet him. With Tycho's charts, I began to plot the orbit of Mars, and after many years of hard work, I published another book on my findings, Astronomia Nova, The New Astronomy. This book contained my first two laws of planetary motion, the law of ellipses and the law of equal areas. After the death of Tycho, I took his position as Rudolf II, the Emperor of Prague's court mathematician. Here I stayed for many years. After Rudolf's death, his ambitious younger brother took control of Prague, and I thought it wisest to leave. I moved to Linz, where I took it upon myself to finish the tedious calculations needed to complete and publish the Rudolphian tables. Tables of calculations based on my previous works. During this time, I published another book, Harmonices Mundi, The Harmony of the Universe, which contained the last of my 3 laws of planetary motion. the law of harmonies. It was at this point that the religious turmoil in Germany was reaching a fever pitch. People were being accused of witchcraft all around, with many thousands being killed every year because of the fear. I was not immune to this religious conflict, as I had been to so many others. During this time, my mother was accused of being a witch, so in 1616, I took on the case for her life. I spent 4 years working to protect her, and finally won the case, saving her, though she died 6 months after due to the strain of trial and torture inflicted upon her to confess to being a witch. By this point, the 30 Years' War was fully raging around me. While I was not immune to its violence, I managed to continue to work on the Rudolphine tables, and in December of 1627, I was finally able to locate a printer for my life's work. I continued out working calculations for the other heavenly movements and caring for my wife and children for 3 more years. Then, on November 15, 1630, I died going to collect money from a debtor. I measured the heavens. Now the earth's shadow I measure. My mind was already in the heavens. Now the shadow of my body rests.
Hello, my name is Henrietta Maria. I began my journey to meet my beloved husband on November 25th, 1609, when I was born in the Louvre Palace in France. I much enjoyed my childhood and found it quite blissful. I was brought up as French royalty and as a Roman Catholic. Upon receiving my first love letter when I was 15, I knew that the man who wrote it, Charles I, was the man I was destined to marry. Simply from his words, I could tell that he was handsome and loyal. He even went as far as to say that we were never better together. She, upon this action of yours, showing herself as loving to me by her discretion upon all occasions, that it marks us all wonder and esteem her. I felt driven to do all that I could to marry him. I didn't care how many hoops I had to jump through, even though I was a Catholic, and he, a Protestant. Since I was so naive back then, I was shocked by how the English did not trust me, and how they were afraid I would affect him with my Roman Catholic beliefs. I strongly disagreed, arguing that our union would help ease the tension between Roman Catholics and Protestants. My marriage to Charles, Prince of Wales, needed a special dispensation from the Pope because it was the first time that a Catholic princess had married a Protestant prince. I was able to persuade the Pope to grant that dispensation. Our wedding was an extravagant celebration, which I found much to delight in. I was dressed almost entirely in silk, and my elaborate colored hair was done beautifully for the big night. I caught Charles looking at me adoringly during the procession, and I smiled back lightly. We were both excited for the festivities planned over the following few days. Banquets, masquerade balls, fireworks, and jousting were all awaiting us. Our wedding was being celebrated mainly in Paris and London, but also in many other towns that were all filled to the brim with hope and joy for the time being. Yet, when my infatuation for Charles faded, I found that we didn't quite see eye to eye. We both had headstrong personalities, and our opposing religions and childhoods caused some fights between us. Eventually, though, the rocky start to our marriage smoothed out, and I began once again to see him as I had originally, for the amazing person that he was. After our initial disagreements, he even allowed me to freely practice my religion around him without a single complaint, insisting that I give thee power to promise in my name that I will take away all penal laws against the Roman Catholics in England. I trust in thee as if thou wert a Protestant. But just as I began to think the future was looking bright, the English Civil War broke out. everyone was feuding over how much power they believed it was right for the king to have, I fought as hard as I could for the royalists, Charles, and anyone who believed that the king should have absolute power. I leapt right into action, but all of my fearless effort was worth nothing in the end. I was forced to flee as quickly as I could to Paris when I caught wind of how badly Charles was being beaten. Charles wrote to me that he would be all right and tried to stay strong for me, but his army was ill-armed and ill-fed. He had no real chance against Parliament, but I admired his efforts. After I ran to Paris, I never saw my beloved husband again. The cruel leader of Parliament, Oliver Cromwell, beheaded him without mercy, without seeing his beauty. They only saw him as a monarch who took too much power, but he was so much more than they would ever know, than they could ever know. I was devastated. How could someone I loved and cared for disappear, just like that? I would never be able to fill the emptiness after he left, but I knew that I had to keep living on in memory of him. Now, after 23 years of marriage, Paris was merely a sad place of exile. My love for both my husband and children tied me to England, but I needed to remain in Paris for my health. So I spent most of my remaining 4 years in Columbus. I placed all of my remaining hopes for Charles's country on my eldest son, Charles II, and he didn't disappoint. I accompanied him to his crowning in England during the Restoration, and he did the best that he could as a monarch with limited power. My life was concluded, knowing that England was in good hands with him, taking every measure possible to appease Parliament and prevent another tragic war.
I, Christopher Wren, translate portions of the Doctrine into Brick's Order Remarkable. I was born in East Knoll in Wiltshire on October 20, 1632. I was the only surviving son of Christopher Wren the Elder and Mary Cox. I was sickly as a child and quite reserved, so I was taught by a private tutor at home. I later went to Windsor for education, where I developed my interest in science. After that, I went to Wadham College, Oxford, and at these two schools, I gained an interest in astronomy, geometry, mathematics, physics, and architecture. I interpreted the Baroque style of England and dominated English architecture for 50 years. My most important work is St. Paul's Cathedral in London. I built 52 churches and helped redesign London after the Great London Fire. I was knighted in 1673 for my work under King Charles II. This honor was bestowed upon me after my resignation from the Slavian chair in Oxford. After I helped develop science and started the Royal Society, I continued this to continue this after my death. As a scientist, I made many contributions. For example, I researched terrestrial magnetism, took part in medical research at Wadham College, and performed experiments involving determining longitude through magnetic variation through lunar observation to help with navigation. My entire life was about improving the knowledge of the world for everyone, including myself.
I am a man of many talents. I was born in December 1642. I aspired to many goals and actually achieved most of them. While I was great at math and science, I also became interested in alchemy, the process of changing atoms and their position in elements. However, before that, I was interested in light physics and the physics of gravity. I am perhaps most famous for my apple story. I was sitting under a tree when suddenly an apple landed on my head. While many today assume that this story signifies that I thought, oh hey, an apple fell, meaning gravity is real. In reality, the point is that I thought about how it fell. I asked myself why the apple never fell to the right, or to the right, or to the left, or just sat there in place. Then it hit me, literally. I realized that there must be a force acting upon everything in the world that applies to all matter. Later, the term gravity was applied to this force. I enjoyed my pursuits in gravitational research, but that wasn't all I was drawn to. I also studied the sciences and physics of light, all recorded in my book, Optics. I researched light and how its rays can reflect and refract. I performed many experiments, all of which I documented. Some of them consisted of tying a string to a prism and moving it back and forth in front of a light ray, while others involved holding a glass up to a window and measuring the path the light travels after passing through the glass. I used a specific method that we now call the scientific method to experiment with light. It involves creating a hypothesis of what you think will happen after and during the experiment, and a conclusion with the final verdict. After learning about light, I pursued an interest in alchemy, the science of changing molecular forms of matter. It was a common belief that you could turn a rock into gold by combining it with other cheap resources. Back then, people thought the way you performed these tricks involved potions and combining different elements. Many famous researchers who attempted to do this would start by looking for the fabled philosopher's stone. While I was learning about reflection and refraction, I began to run low on funds, but luckily I was invited to join the parliament. While part of the government, I had higher authority and could borrow government money for experimentation. During my years in the parliament, I was asked to join the Royal Society, a group based around the progression of sciences and technology. After many years in the Royal Society, I was asked to become president of it. People say I had odd religious views too. I believed in the Bible, as I am Christian, but some parts didn't add up for me. I do not believe in Trinity, according to hidden unpublished documents that were found after my death. Some people of my time considered me as a non-believer after hearing this. To others, I was a very uncommon man. People didn't share my religious beliefs with me, and I spent less time actively participating in religious things. In conclusion, I learned many things about sciences and created a new paths to future abilities in the scientific world.
Привет, people of the West. My name is Peter the Great. My story begins at the age of 4 with the death of my father. My mother had a fascination with the Western world because of how much progression it was making, and I naturally took after my mother. When I was a young man, I would visit foreign colonies of Western tradesmen in Moscow. There I received some of my first impressions of what the Western world and Western Europeans were like. When my half-brother, who was Tsar, died, a power struggle broke out between my mother's family, the Narishkins, and my father's first wife's family, the Moloslavskis. I became Tsar, but most of the Russian army did not approve of this, and most of my family was killed. I became co-Tsar with my half-brother Ivan, but my half-sister Sofia was the regent who took control over the government. I eventually grew into a hard-working young man who had an exceptional will for progress. In 1689, Sofia was overthrown, and by that time my half-brother Ivan had died, and I now had complete power. My first and primary objective as Tsar was to reform Russia into an outstanding and progressive Western country. Over the course of the next 25 years, I reformed every part of national life: administration, industry, commerce, and technology and culture. As a direct result of these changes, a middle class started to appear. New businesses that fueled Russia's economy. Factories were coming into operation which employed both serfs and free men. For upper class, I made education more accessible and encouraged them to travel abroad as I had to get a taste of Western culture. Along with this, I reformed the military. I made Russia a navy as well as a modern army that could compete with Western world powers. This involved innovations in weapon technologies and related tactics and strategy and enormous increase in size of armies and navies. With this new military, I started to connect Russia to Europe by gaining access to seaports. I exploited the conflict in the Great Northern War to fight Swedish to fight the Swedish and gain access to the Baltic Sea. With this came the enormous profits in trade goods, and I built the city of St. Petersburg in the new territory I had gained. It was to be a symbol and center of my reformed and reunited Russia, and a testament to my achievements and reforms. I did not go to war just for wealth and strategic locations, however. I also did it for the glory of Russia at the same time. After I had won my victory against the Swedes, their king, Charles XII, he fled to the Turks. He tried to convince the Turks to declare war on Russia, which I embraced with open arms. After all, a new Turkish war offered opportunities for propaganda to Russians still basking in the glory of Poltava and the Baltic campaign. There was also Russian Orthodox Christians in those lands who needed liberating. I was taking upon myself a heavy burden for the sake of God. However, even though I had accomplished much and won many battles, my legacy was threatened by my own son. Throughout my life, I had difficulty controlling my emotions, and I often lashed out when things were not going according to plan. So, when my son did not share the same views and mindset that I did, I condemned him and later killed him. Nevertheless, my legacy lives on in many aspects of today's Russia. When I passed away on February 8th, 1725, having guided my homeland to path of perfection, from then on I was known as Peter the Great, Emperor of all Russias.
My name is Frederick II of Prussia, better known as Frederick the Great. I was born in 1712 in Berlin. During my childhood, my father was cruel and abusive. He was not proud of me, and he would beat me if I made any mistakes. He forced me to take a class on warfare, rather than my preferred studies of the arts and sciences. I wanted to fulfill the Platonic ideal of the philosopher king, but my father had other ideas for me. When I turned 18, I and my friend Kata decided to escape from this torture of strict schedules and beatings. We were caught, and Kata was executed. On June 12, 1733, I was forced to marry Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Bevern. I could not imagine sharing any intimacy with her, so I gifted her a palace and made my brother heir to the throne. I served in the army for a few years, during the War of Polish Succession, and my father gave me a palace in Rheinsberg. While in Rheinsberg, I wrote Anti-Machiavel, an idealistic refutation of Machiavelli. My good friend Voltaire helped to distribute it, and the book was a great success. My father, Frederick William I, died in 1740, and I ascended to the throne. I inherited, along with Prussia, its grand army, which had no equal regarding discipline and firepower. When Maria Theresa ascended to the Austrian throne a few months later, I sent my armies in to invade the Austrian province of Silesia. It was all going very well, and I occupied Silesia in just 7 weeks. But the Austrians eventually fought back. In the Battle of Molwitz, the Austrians surprised me with their vigor, and I thought we were near defeat, so I fled in fear of being captured. My army subsequently won the battle without their general's help. I used Molwitz as my school for later battles, and learned not to make the same mistakes again. After many more military victories for my armies in small battles, Austria was forced to sign over Silesia to me in treaty. In 1756, I saw the beginnings of another war. Austria allied with France against Great Britain, whom I sided with. My neighboring countries began conspiring against me, so I took the initiative and invaded Saxony, beginning the 7 Years' War. This campaign took far too long, and when I attempted to invade Austria in 1757, I was defeated in the Battle of Kolin. Despite this, when the Austrians began pushing me for Saxony and Silesia, I defeated them with no trouble. I was still surrounded, with Austria, France, Sweden, Russia, and Saxony allied against me, Great Britain, Hesse, Hanover, and Brunswick. My armies were severely depleted from the numerous battles I had fought. When the King of Britain died, I lost financial support from them, and my country seemed doomed to fall. Then, in 1762, Empress Elizabeth of Russia died, and Peter III, the new ruler, joined my side. He pulled his forces out of Prussia and lent me his support for the remainder of the war. When the war finally ended, with the other countries fighting until stalemate, Catherine the Great, ruler of Russia, and wife of Peter III, made an 8-year alliance against me. In 1772, tensions were rising again, and to prevent Russia from taking land from the Austrians in the war, the three of us, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, agreed to split Poland between us. I got the smallest, but the most developed piece of Poland. It connected the eastern and western parts of my empire. I have hated Poles since my youth, and their culture is stupid. I decided that the slovenly Polish trash had to go. I encouraged Germanization by settling 300,000 German colonists in the area, enacted a new tax system that did not favor the Polish, and forced their service in the military. I also confiscated the land of their nobles, as well as their monasteries, and redistributed the royal estates among German landowners. In the later years of my life, I spent most of my time at Sanssouci, my private palace near Berlin. In 1785, I signed a treaty with the United States of America, recognizing their independence as a country. And as all of my friends passed away, I became increasingly lonely. I died on August 17, 1786, at the age of 74. I planned to be buried at Sanssouci, but my brother had my remains buried with those of my father. Many years later, near the end of World War II, Adolf Hitler had both my father's and my remains transferred to a salt mine for protection. They were later found by the United States Army and moved again. I was finally laid to rest at Sanssouci on August 17, 1991, exactly 205 years after my death.
Of my life, but you probably want the real story. So here it is. I was born on November 26, 1831, at an army barrack in Bombay, India, to Mary Ann Glascott and Thomas Edwards. My father died before I was baptized, leaving my mother with no money or social status. This was due to my father and grandfather being low-ranking officers. My grandfather had no opportunities to marry into a higher class since English women were forbidden to immigrate to India and marry locals. So like most soldiers of his rank, he married a native. There are no accounts of my grandmother, but people knew she had Indian heritage, one of the many reasons for me to cover up my upbringing later in life. With no money or social status, my mother remarried. She married Patrick Donahue, who brought with him money and a higher position in the army. Living in an army barrack meant we had to move from time to time. Nevertheless, my siblings and I had a more advanced education and enrichment than would a person attending an English boarding school. Our classes were taught by older students or a sergeant. There was much more freedom and classes were interracial. Our family lived in an Anglo, Indian, and other mixed-race communities. As a result of this upbringing, I was raised in a multicultural community of extraordinary richness and integration. I played with the children of Christians, Muslims, and Hindus. I never forgot the lessons of equality among the races that I had learned. After my dear husband, Thomas, died in 1859, I was faced with a dilemma similar to my mother's when her first husband died. I could have remarried or moved back with my family. I decided to do neither and went out in the world alone to support me and my children, Avis and Louie. From that moment, I knew that I would not get anywhere in life with a history like mine, so I presented myself as a full-blooded, educated English woman with a higher status than I had. And it worked! I was never discovered, never unmasked, and went on to perform that new identity for the rest of my life, actually becoming the character I had made. Changing my story allowed me to take a job at the Royal Palace in Siam in 1862 as a governess to King Mongkut's children. I influenced many of the princes, especially Prince Chulalongkorn, Mongkut's successor. I taught the children English, Western cultures, and embedded the idea of equality amongst other nations as well. During my 4 years in Siam, I had made friends with the women of the harem, as well as aiding the king with diplomatic affairs, deciphering Western policies, cultures, and attitudes towards Siam. However, I fell ill in 1865 and left Siam in the summer of 1866. For the rest of my life, I lived in New York and Halifax, in addition to traveling often. I wrote 4 books with a strong theme of equality throughout all of them. Being in Siam gave me a sense of confidence, and I began to speak in public lectures about Siam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sanskrit, and later on, Chinese race. When Chulalongkorn became king, he abolished slavery, prostration, and imprisonment of wife and child for the father's debt. I was overjoyed that these changes had been made. While I lived in Halifax, I was involved with the founding of the Women's Suffrage Association. The last years of my life were dreary. In 1911, my daughter's husband, Tom Fish, died, and my daughter, Avis, had died many years before. I had a stroke that same year, leaving me blind, and I was practically bedridden for 3 years until I died in 1915. I leave my stories and ideas with my family and you, so they can be passed on to others and be inspired.
Greetings. My name is Nicola Tesla. I was born in 1856 in Serbia. During my lifetime, I invented great machines capable of linking the world together in ways most people couldn't imagine. I worked with the likes of Thomas Edison, J.P. Morgan, and George Westinghouse. When I was young, I attended university and worked for an electrical company in a town called Maribor. But I began to make bad choices near the end of my stay. My father was worried for me. He thought I wasn't in good health. He was foolish to think that. I was studying to become an engineer. I was studying so hard that the professors were worried for me. I do not regret this. However, I frequented pubs and I developed a dependence on alcohol and became addicted to gambling. My father implored me to return home, but I refused until I was banished. Then, 2 months later, my poor father passed. I was deeply saddened and conquered all my addictions to get back on track and focus on my work. In June 1884, I sailed to New York with nothing but 4 cents in my pocket because there simply wasn't enough opportunity for someone like me back in my home country. This was where I first met Thomas Edison. I worked with him for a while, but eventually he laid me off. Nevertheless, I became the greatest competitor of Edison because of my ideas. This was possible because I was fortunate enough to find backers to fund them. I won in the war of currents because my technology was simply better. Direct current was limited in many ways, so that even Edison, after years of making propaganda against alternating current, switched to it because it was superior. I also helped electricity become more widespread. Factories were using more electricity with mass production. To demonstrate alternating current to the world, I realized that the Chicago World's Fair was the best place. News spread, and many people were looking forward to this event. When the day came, President Cleveland pushed a button, and thousands of lights lit up the fair. People called it the City of Lights. From then on, most electrical devices sold used alternating current. George Westinghouse and I worked together and we created the first hydroelectric power plant that used alternating current. The power plant was so efficient that the electricity was transmitted all the way from Niagara, all the way to the town of Buffalo, 25 miles away. It was a great accomplishment. My next big project was my Tower of Global Power. J.P. Morgan backed my ambitions and I went to work straight away. Things seemed to be going well until Marconi transmitted the letter S across the Atlantic. Morgan heard of this and thought that Marconi's vision was not only better and worked, and that it was effective too. I tried telling him that Marconi used some of my ideas, but it was to no avail. With the remaining funds, I attempted in vain to finish the tower and construction had to be stopped. A while later, I began to slow down my work. I wasn't creating world-changing machines, but I still tried. I went to a hotel in New York on the 33rd floor, room 3327. This is the last thing I did. Today, I assume most electric devices are powered by alternating current. After all, why wouldn't they be? It is vastly superior to direct current, and as far as I know, there isn't another way to use electricity. Based on what I have witnessed in my lifetime, I think it is safe to assume that many decades later, my technology is still being used today.
Russian Revolution. If you haven't figured out who I might be, my name is Nikolai Alexandrovich Romanov, more commonly known as Tsar Nicholas II. I know, you're wondering, why don't I have an accent? Well, it's been 100 years since I've been dead, and I'm still trying to get back to being alive. My life started in 1868 near St. Petersburg. My father, Alexander III, was the Tsar of Russia. My mother, Maria Feodorovna, was a princess of Denmark. As the eldest son of the family, I was destined to become the next Tsar. My father emphasized overplaying as a way to show Russianness. Though he taught me much about being a person and being pious, his misanthropy, overprotectiveness, and insistence on complete obedience were not guaranteed to produce big, confident personality. Neither my father's teachings nor my temperament was enough for the enormous mission that awaited me as an autocratic ruler of a big empire. I was not intellectually talented, yet I was physically gifted, but during formal occasions, I did not shine. I like to keep my circle of friends private and serene. My father died in 1894 due to nephritis. I succeeded him and married Princess Alix of Hesse and by Rhine, whom I love dearly. I was crowned Tsar in Moscow on May 26, 1896. I was inexperienced for the role of Emperor of all the Russias. Nevertheless, I derived my authority from God, and it was my sacred duty to preserve my absolute power intact. I was always interested in Asia, even when I was still Tsarevich. After I became Tsar, I wanted to increase our influence over Korea. Knowing that Japan also had a hand there, I did not cower. This was the main cause of the Russo-Japanese War, in which we suffered a terrible defeat in 1905. This war contributed to the 1905 revolution and the demands for reforms. I reluctantly signed the October Manifesto that created the Duma, which is a legislative body that controlled my decisions. Because it is my sacred duty to maintain my power, I established the new fundamental laws, which ensured my autocracy and meant I was allowed to ignore decisions made by the Duma. My interest in the Balkans was a great mistake, as it tangled us in the Great War. In spite of some victories, it went badly for us. Also, too little food made it to the cities. I tried to keep my people safe, but failed at the end. The public was very unhappy with my work. Riots broke out in St. Petersburg, and even though I sent troops to restore order, it was too late. The government resigned, and the Duma, supported by the army, called me to abdicate. I renounced the throne on March 15, 1917, and instead of passing down the throne to my son, I decided to give it to my brother Michael. But he refused to take it. I was detained at Tsarskaye Selo, Lvov's provisional government. It was planned that my family and I would be sent to England, but instead, mainly because of the opposition of the Petrograd Soviets, the Revolutionary Workers, and the Soldiers' Council, we were removed to Tobolsk in Western Siberia, where the Bolsheviks took over and our situations worsened. Even though the government and we were not in good conditions, I was still trying to be the best father and husband I could be. I tried to keep the family spirit up with hope because I believed help was coming. But sadly, on July 17, 1918, we were woken up at 2 a.m. in the morning and were led down to the basement of the Imperial House. Suddenly informed of our execution, I was in shock. There was no time to think. The guards opened fire and I died with my family.
Russian Empire. I have two older half-sisters my mother had with a man she married at age 15. After his death, her family arranged for her to marry my father, Abraham Goldman. He wanted a son desperately, as he thought that having a daughter would be a failure on his part. Throughout my childhood, Abraham would violently punish my siblings and I would never disobey him. I was the most rebellious of all my siblings and was frequently the subject of his beatings. My mother never told him to tone down his feelings. She hardly interacted with him at all, in fact. Fortunately, Helena, my oldest sister, would comfort us in times of need, giving some happiness in my childhood. When I was 7, we moved to the German Empire. I enrolled in school, and just like at home, I rebelled and was beaten for it. One teacher would beat students' hands with a ruler. Another would molest less female students. I fought back and he was fired. We moved again, this time to St. Petersburg. My father attempted to open several shops. There, all failed. My family at this point was rather poor, and my father made me quit school. I had to work several jobs to support the family, including one in a corset shop, but that didn't stop me from getting an education. I began to study the world around me in current political turmoil. I was heavily influenced by nihilistic ideals. My father, however, continued to try to mold me into the woman he thought I should be. He wanted me to marry the man of his choice at age 15, as was tradition. We would fight on this constantly, as I wanted to marry for love. My disliking for this culture wasn't helped by the fact that men would visit the corset shop and harass me. One even took me to his hotel room and violently assaulted me. I will never view things in the same light after that incident. When my sister Helena planned to join my other sister in Rochester, New York, I begged my father to let me go. It took me threatening suicide to allow me to go, even though Helena offered to pay. A while later, the rest of my family joined us because there was anti-Semitism growing in Europe. I found work as a seamstress for a while, but when I demanded a raise, they refused to give it to me, and I quit and worked at a smaller shop. While at my new job, I met a man who shared my frustrations with factory work and books. We married after 4 months, and he moved in with my family. I was becoming more politically engaged, and he was becoming jealous and distant. Less than a year after our marriage, we divorced. My family then disowned me for being too loose. While in New York City, I met Alexander Burkham at a cafe for radicals. He was an anarchist who invited me to a speech later that evening. I grew fond of him and soon took on public speaking for myself. At my first speech, something strange happened. In a flash, I saw it. Every one of my 3 years in Rochester, the Garrison factory, its drudgery and humiliation, the failure of my marriage, Chicago crime, I began to speak. Words I had never heard myself utter before came pouring out, faster and faster. They came with passionate intensity. The audience had vanished, itself had disappeared. I was conscious only of my words, my ecstatic song. I became more of a public figure after that. And then after the Homestead strike, Alexander and I planned to assassinate the Homestead factory's manager. We expected to inspire workers to revolt against the capitalist system. To fund our scheme, I resorted to prostitution. Alexander was sentenced to 22 years in prison for murder. My continued activism against the capitalist system landed me in and out of prison many times in America. In prison, I studied medical working, which I later put into practice to earn money for myself. Once, a strange man inspired by me shot President William McKinley. I was arrested for his crime, and on top of that, he attempted to interrogate me when I was out minding my own business. I had no connection to him whatsoever, and so I was released. Although, to this day, I still believe he was just trying to do the right thing. Eventually, I grew tired of lecture audiences. I wanted to access the people who truly wanted to bring down the capitalist system. I wrote books and joined forces with Margaret Sanger in illegally distributing birth control and information about it. I was arrested yet again for my efforts. Soon after, I was deported from America for being too anarchist. I continued to move around making speeches, getting arrested, making speeches, getting arrested, just not in America. Finally, at age 70, I suffered from a stroke. It was humiliating. Just to think that there I was, the greatest orator in America, unable to utter a single word. Fortunately, I died a few months after and was freed from that vegetable state.
When I was young, someone told me that my dream was impossible to accomplish. I learned that day that I have little respect for those who talk but don't act. I am David BenGurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel. I have been dreaming of the idea of Eretz Israel since my childhood in Poland. I even said that one day I will be the leader of Israel. That idea will only become more clear when I was introduced to Zionism by Theodore Herzl, when he visited my town. After reading the letters of another pioneer, I was sure that traveling to Israel was the right thing to do. I realized that no other religion was connected to the physical existence of a nation. The process of traveling wasn't easy. For one thing, I was told it was a foolish idea. However, pioneering is Israel's lifeblood, and at the time, there wasn't enough of it. Even after getting there, the lack of work and constant diseases made it impossible to live there. After living there for a while as a farmer, I was given the opportunity to work in the paper. I didn't want to abandon the farming necessary for living in Israel, but I needed to spread the ideas of Zionism, so I accepted it. At the start of World War I felt I needed to fight, but I was deported, and so I went to New York. Once there, I built up support for Zionism and showed support for the Turkish, as I felt they would give Israel the best future. Then the British announced that they would help build a Jewish state, so I turned my support towards them. After they won, many Jews, including myself, migrated to Palestine in order to start the Jewish state. This was the start of Israel's conflict with Palestine. The British sided with Palestine, but we stood our ground. When World War II happened, we had to put our plans on hold in order to fight the war. Once over, America and the Soviet Union instead helped us build instead. I became the Prime Minister of the new nation of Israel and served for more than a decade. After my years of serving as Prime Minister, I withdrew from politics. I would go back to what I was doing before, when I first got to Israel, and that would be farming. I feel that working with the land is important, and I'm someone who speaks with actions.
Hello everyone, my name is Alan Turing, and I was born 1912 in Maida Vale, London, despite my parents being from India. They sent me to stay with a nice old couple in Britain with my brother. At a young age, I displayed signs of high intelligence despite being called an untidy dreamer by my teachers. When I attended the well-known independent Sherborne School at age 13, I became particularly interested in math and science. I became friends with Christopher Morgan, who was also a bit of a child prodigy himself, and we wanted to go to Cambridge together. However, Morgan died of bovine tuberculosis 2 years later. Afterward, I did still get that scholarship to Cambridge and studied there 1931 to 1934. I proved the central limit theorem during my time there and was elected fellow on graduation. Later, I wrote a paper on computability of the Turing machine. The Turing machine can simulate any computer algorithm, no matter how complicated. In 1939, I went to the Government Code and Cipher School and supervised HUD 8 for a time. HUD 8 was focused on breaking the German Navy codes, and after my outstanding performance there, I perfected the Polish code-breaking technique, the bomba, which was pivotal in the Ultra program. It's estimated to have saved 14 million lives and shortened World War II by 2 years. After the war, I worked at the National Physical Laboratory, where I designed the ACE, among the first designs for stored computer algorithms. In 1947, I went on sabbatical to the University of Cambridge and wrote a seminal paper on intelligent machinery. This led to Cambridge developing and running Pilot ACE, which was one of the first computers created in England and directly inspired by my work. In 1948, I joined Max Newman's Computing Machine Laboratory at the Victoria University of Manchester, where I helped develop the Manchester computers and became interested in mathematical biology. I wrote a paper on the chemical basis of morphogenesis and predicted oscillating chemical reactions before they were even discovered. In 1952, I was prosecuted for homosexual acts and convicted of gross indecency. I had two choices: chemical castration or spending a few years in prison. I went for chemical castration so that I could continue my research. In 2 years, I was found dead from cyanide poisoning, and it is still debated whether it was suicide, assassination, or accidental poisoning due to a very cursory investigation.
responsible for the deaths of thousands of Englishmen. I was born in Wierzitz, and in March of 1912, to my two beautiful and hard-working parents, Annie von Klitzbrock and Magnus Führer von Braun. In my early years, I became fascinated with astronomy and the planets, and knew that it would be my life's purpose. From there, I proceeded up through the education system, becoming popular for my help in the discovery of several new ideas about space travel. This brought me to the attention of several Nazi officers, and when that party took over, I rose quickly through their ranks. This culminated in being assigned to a compound named Peenemünde. There, I worked with a group of other professionals to design what became the V-2 missile. However, the Nazis began losing, and in a desperate attempt to survive, I hid all my blueprints in a mine shaft. Then, when the opportunity presented itself, I slipped away to defect to America. I was obviously not trusted immediately, but through hard work and dedication, as well as living in their comparatively inadequate conditions, I proved my trustworthiness and was brought fully into American society. I helped capture Americans' interest in space travel, and eventually went on to help create and lead NASA. It was almost directly because of my efforts that we managed to land on the moon. Unfortunately, the moon is not Mars, and I still retire, creating plans to try and colonize that planet. Sadly, before my ambitions could be fulfilled, I sadly passed away in June of 1955 due to cancer. In line with my wife's intense dislike for publicity, I was buried the next day in the Ivy Hill Cemetery in Alexandria, Virginia, in the presence of a small group of friends and family.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this juncture, we will begin dinner. However, I ask that you wait just a couple of minutes to let our characters gather their food first, so they can be ready for the next part of the program. So we'll gather again in about 20 minutes, and
But before you leave,
We have a little something.
this would not have been possible at all without Kale. Kale Gerard is amazing. Because of how amazing he is as a teacher, we wanted to put together a little something that is all of our portraits, including Matthew, who is not here but is in our history class, Matthew Ho. And underneath each one of our portraits is a message from each of us. And mine is very short, but I'll just say what I think of Kale. So I think you have taught me that teaching is a noble profession. As far as I know, your teaching may affect eternity. Who knows where your influence may stop? So, Kale?
oh,
You cannot go home without these flowers.
okay. Thank you so much. That's very sweet.
Yes.
Well-
And we'd also like to thank the hard work and diligence of David and Julia Rule. Where are you, David and Julia? See? That's how hard they work. I mean, jeez.
They were wanting.
So, most of you guys are probably hungry. And in a moment, you'll be able to eat the food that David and Julia have provided.
There they are.
Come in, help us.
You haven't tried it yet.
Someone is saying, come over here.
All right, you guys can get up and go eat.
Mr. Marx, Mr. BenGurion, Miss Goldman, and Mr. Turing, I cannot help but thinking that all you atheists are the same. Misunderstanding truth and undermining society.
What are you saying? It's easy for many people to think that non-religious people are all the same. While both Marx and I, for instance, might not believe in God, he's still very...
This is true. BenGurion brings up a good point. I'm sure people turn to atheism for several different reasons. Mine is that I'm simply fed up with the systemic nature of organized religion.
I cannot understand what you're talking about, Mr. Marx. How can you be against every sort of religion? I support the idea of believing what you want, but rejecting all religion makes no sense.
As I have said, Henrietta Maria, religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. During my life, I saw it being used by the ruling class as an ideological weapon to justify the suffering of the poor as something inevitable and God-given. Though I do not agree with her on every single point, the only other person here who has enough sense to realize the power that religion has destroyed for our society, that would be Miss Goldman.
Finally, someone here understands the true purpose of religion in society. How it dominates man's mind, how it humiliates and degrades his soul. God is everything, man is nothing, says religion. But out of that nothing, God has created a kingdom so despotic, so tranquil, so cruel, so terribly exacting, that naught but gloom and tears and blood have ruled the world since gods began. It is more than an ideological thing. It is a foul creation made to numb the minds of people, keeping them down and oblivious to the struggles around them.
Preach it, comrade, preach it. Furthermore, we must recognize that religion reinforces the lower class's alienation, an alienation from that which is produced or created. Religion merely acts as an opioid to dull the pain of exploitation. Religion distracts attention from the true source of suffering, that is, capitalism.
On the contrary, Mr. Marx, religion is harmless, and I think that it is good. There are good morals to be learned from all religions.
This is an example of what I mean. Despite neither Marx nor I being very religious, I cannot agree with him on this. You might feel that religion is spurious, but that does not mean that it's useless. Religion can be a part of culture, and it is very good at teaching ethical values.
Yes, religion can be a part of culture, but its function there is to keep the people down. The culture with religion is an oppressive one, regardless.
But, Fräulein Goldman, how does a culture function without something higher to believe in? How do you keep yourself happy and confident with your place in the universe without the knowledge of God?
To use a modern phrase, Kepler, it seems you have drunk the Kool-Aid. Though you do not come from an era marked by modern capitalism, you must ask yourself about the suspect correlation between religion and power throughout human history. Whether at the time of masters and slaves, landowners and peasants, or capitalists and factory workers.
What do you mean?
Okay, who benefits from religion? The powerful ruling class or the hard workers who obediently worship their God? The answer, time and time again, is evident. Religion is encouraged by the ruling class to distract attention from the true source of suffering, that is power, which nowadays has been taken in the form of capitalism, allowing the division between the classes to be preserved.
Religion is for all. There is no ruling class under the eyes of God. We all look to God to realize our place in the universe.
Sure, if all means the ruling class. Of course there is no ruling class in the eyes of God, because God doesn't exist.
Now. You can only feel bad for the deceived masses.
You are all deceiving yourselves, and the masses. Whether Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Hindu, or atheist, you are misled. Orthodox Christianity is the only true faith. All the rest are heresy and lies.
Sorry, Nicholas, your intolerance is astounding. And Herr Marx, deceiving the masses is a drastic over-exaggeration. Although I was never particularly religious, even I recognize the existence of God on some level, and I think it would be a mistake to abandon it entirely.
I think that anyone could easily replace God with their own curiosity. If people were curious about the world, instead of living in unquestioning obedience to religion and languishing in the idea of heaven, they could advance and flourish.
But this all assumes that a religious culture is inherently oppressive. It is not necessary to blindly follow religion to be part of its culture, or to learn from its ethical values.
You make good points. Even if you don't think God created the universe, condemning religion is entirely far too extreme.
I'm not condemning religion, merely questioning it, and attempting to open minds to new ideas, such as how science may be the true creator. Have you even opened your mind to that possibility?
God is the one who gave science to humanity, in order for us to better understand his intentions.
Science explains the plans of the true creator, God, to imply that it was any other way, there are some other forces greater than God, inconceivable.
And how do you know that religion can be proven through science? You have no evidence for it that I can see.
Neither do you have any evidence against religion. How could the universe be made without God? He was one who crafted it. He is like a blacksmith in his craft. Would his technique describe his craft, or would his customers be what describes him? His technique being science, the customers being humanity, and the blacksmith being God. In other words, would God's tool, science, describe the universe, or would humanity use science to describe God?
At the same time, there are many ways to discover the secrets of the universe and the truths about it. I admire your architectural skill, Mr. Wren. It connects to some of my alchemical and mystical research. Some of us believe that the original plans and designs of Solomon's temple were based on the underlying concepts of the universe. If we could discover them, then whole truth would be revealed.
What an intriguing idea, Mr. Wren. Although I'm not sure that it fits well with your other mathematical and physical studies.
On the contrary, all knowledge is ultimately connected, both mystical and the material. That's why I pursued both.
It's hard to believe that someone who influenced the development of science and math could believe such idiocy, Mr. Newman. As with the evidence for religion, your alchemical, mystical baloney does not hold up.
That last point may be so, Hector. But if you want evidence for religion, just look at the sun. It is the brightest and most glorious of God's creations. It is at the center of the universe. And what about the orbits of the planets and their perfect shape? Not to forget about the harmonic ratios of the platonic solids fitting with the orbits of the 6 planets.
About that, the sun isn't actually the center of the universe.
And the orbit of the planets aren't perfect. They're elliptical. You proved this.
Also, small side note, there are 9 planets, not 6. Those who came after you discovered Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto.
On top of that, the harmonic ratios make no sense on any level in any form. It didn't include any new planets. It's just insane.
Well, okay. To be fair, later in life, I did say that my harmonic ratios would not work as they were too inaccurate. I do see what you mean, however.
I'm glad at least someone saw reason. Actually, speaking of things that can't be understood by rational people, Turing, can you tell me about these supposedly infallible thinking machines?
I'm glad you asked, Braun. They have much potential in modern society. They are already capable of calculating at speeds faster than humanly possible. Computers will become amazing tools that may accelerate scientific development to a stage never before seen.
And with the use of alternating current and the wireless technology I was exploring, these computers could be instrumental to scientific advances. I was trying to do just that at the Barton Cliff Tower. I admit not all my ideas about energy transmission work, but sending messages this way seems to have finally become a reality. If I had the support to continue my research, it would have happened much sooner.
Amazing. It's great to see you both have such passion. I mean, aboard a spaceship, humans would be empirically better, but it's still great that you think so highly of your projects.
I believe that at the end of the century, the use of words and general educated opinion will have altered so much that no one will be able to speak of machines thinking without expecting to be contradicted.
What do you mean, Mr. Turing?
Artificial intelligence, machines that think. They would be able to do so much and would advance science to the extreme. While the scientific and industrial revolutions continue to have a significant impact on our society and the environment, The information revolution, based on my ideas of thinking machines, appears to be the next major adjustment for people.
What a strange and wonderful thought, Mr. Turing. It sounds like a wild speculation, but often that is where great theories begin, with guesses and imagination.
Well, Mr. Dean, I think that mathematical demonstrations being built upon the impregnable foundations of geometry and arithmetic are the only truth that can sink into the mind of man. Void of all uncertainty, and all other discourses participate more or less in truth, according as their subject are more or less capable of mathematical demonstrations. Don't you think one should be careful about unfounded speculation?
Yes, Mr. Wren, I agree that science is based on truth, but sometimes you have to make an uncertain guess, which is why the scientific method works so well. Because all of it is based on one starting theory, which can develop and evolve with experimentation and verification.
I prefer the truth. However, I do feel that guessing to start you off on the right foot may be necessary at times.
What is your opinion on the rest of the scientific method then?
I do believe that it supplies a good structure for increasing our knowledge. We seek answers to our questions starting with a hypothesis. We then predict results that would follow if it were true, and then test those predictions through repeated logical experiments. Of course, we must also test the opposite, whether they are false. We cannot be so wedded to an idea that we cannot give it up if it cannot be proved. By observing and analyzing the results, we confirm and deny our hypothesis, and then revisit it as needed.
Yes, I agree. The scientific method is necessary to every nation. It leads to progression and convenience.
I agree, Tsar Peter. With enlightenment in science, we can hope for ever increasing knowledge and the improvement of people in society. Who knows what we might achieve as we learn more? Perhaps we will even discover worlds and people beyond our own.
Perhaps so, Your Majesty. Kepler, do you agree that a time will come when men will stretch out their eyes and they should see planets like our Earth?
I do believe that humans will. With the gift from God of our keen minds and our ability to progress, we will be able to look further into God's domain and discover His plan for the universe.
Exactly. As a wise Kaiser replied just now, it is the destiny of mankind to reach out beyond the planets and perhaps even the solar system. There are few dreams of the future which have woven so fascinating a web around human fantasy, and mine particularly, as a flight through space. One day we may even be able to colonize any planet as easily as we do Earth. It is nice to meet people who share my view.
Now you are reaching beyond our human limits. To learn about God's domain is our purpose on Earth, yes. However, to dare step off Earth into His domain, well, there is a reason we humans were kicked out of Eden.
Your age truly does encourage your backwards views. Traveling through space and stepping onto Mars is no more a sin than traveling across the sea to visit my homeland. Or is that too forbidden by God?
Kepler, great scientific advancements shouldn't be hampered by religion. Although I think that religion is good, it shouldn't impact scientific developments negatively.
I did some research and looked at your modern space travel. I was fascinated that people in your age developed the ability to fly. But traveling to God's domain would be blasphemy. We should not risk angering the divine for fear of His wrath. However, either need we fear to diminish a miracle by explaining.
The miracle of the Enlightenment itself continues to guide the world. Rulers such as I sought to support scientists and thinkers, and some of us even strove to add to the store of knowledge with our own writings and research. In my relationship with Voltaire, I grew and learned towards my goal of being an example of Plato's philosopher king. The scientific revolution and its results were inestimable.
I agree. Science and the revolutions that it created are the most prized Western developments. I first had experience with these methods of discovery when I was on my trip through the Netherlands, England, and other parts of Europe to see how Russia could benefit from them. In order to learn from the West, I studied as a shipwright in Amsterdam. Thank you all for pioneering such a revolutionary method.
Peter, you might recall that when you traveled through England, you stayed in a man's home near London.
Yes, that is true. Why do you ask?
Well, I was tasked with tallying the damages for government reimbursement because of the destruction caused during your stay. No part of the house escaped damage. All the floors were covered with grease ink. And 3 new floors had to be provided. The curtains, quilts, and bed linens were torn to pieces. All the chairs in the house were broken or had disappeared, probably used to stoke the fires. 300 window panes were broken, and 25 pictures very much torn, and all frames broken. The garden, which was Evelyn's pride, was ruined.
Oh, yes, I remember that. You must forgive me, though. I had to make the most of my trip. What can I say? I loved your country, and I guess I expressed it a little too much in the wrong way. We did have fun racing those wheelbarrows in the garden, and those paintings were perfect target practice.
It is no matter the concern. I was just surprised by what I had been assigned.
Nevertheless, Peter, it is admirable that you wish to expand Russia's knowledge with Western science.
The scientific progress that your research of Newton Kepler inspired is important and should be developed, but without the sacrifice of our humanity. Instead, we should advance science in order to expand the understanding of the universe for everyone. I helped create the Royal Society for Improving Natural Knowledge. Our motto was Nullius in verba, meaning take nobody's word for it. In other words, check the facts for yourself.
This is the exact mindset that I apply to all my research and try to teach to others. I admire that you try to teach them all.
Yes, indeed. To me, the way in which the Enlightenment movement came out of the scientific revolution is nothing short of captivating. My father impressed on me the importance of logic and progress, two values that he garnered from reading authors such as Kant and Voltaire. These values were the foundation for new technology and, for better or for worse, the Industrial Revolution, which strengthened Europe both economically and militarily and allowed it to conquer the Americas, Africa, and Asia, and to create empires and colonies, sadly. It encouraged the development of capitalism, again, sadly, and strengthened the middle class and their desire for political power. Eventually, the bourgeoisie began to revolt against the absolutists in liberal revolutions, such as the American and the French, which argued for liberty, fraternity, and equality, at least for middle-class men.
On the topic of equality, I would like to extend it to all races, genders, and social classes, and hear all your opinions about it.
I approve of equality between all genders, since I believe in not conforming to society's expectations of what it means to be a woman. After all, Charles did not represent the ideals of masculinity, and I did not conform to the prevailing ideas of a woman's role. I understand that you consider yourself a feminist, and I feel like I would consider myself one too, if it were a movement during my lifetime.
Well, there was a feminist movement during my time, although it was not about equality for all. It was classist, exclusive, and racist. It focused mainly on voting rights for upper middle class women and left everyone else out of the equation.
Well, it was a start. I can appreciate that. That there at least was a movement there, but there should have been more of an effort to include everyone. Were women more respected as a result to your women's movement?
I don't know about my movement in particular, but rather the movements of women around the globe coming together has made an impact. I, for one, have suffered at the hands of men for years and have found it difficult to trust them. I am certain I am not alone, and that change will come if we come together to spread feminist ideals. After all, the demand for equal rights in every vocation of life is just and fair.
Oh, definitely. I can attest that women helped the world. I helped establish the women's suffrage group in Halifax. We helped with education and rights for other people, in addition to women, of course. I too believe that everyone is created equal, but actions of people can affect how I view them, and I'm quite sure that should apply for all.
Stop this discussion right now. I cannot take any more about what you people are talking about. Being born equal? And what is this term I've been hearing? Feminism? Are you people mad? Anybody can see that a woman is beneath a man and that a peasant is beneath a nobleman. I, for instance, made the table of grades for commoners to rise up according to their merit. At birth, people do not deserve equality. They deserve to be treated based on their work and dedication.
Ah, yes, Peter. Feminism is the radical notion that women are human beings. Psh, get out of here, man. I despise a man who is afraid of a woman's strength. Feminism does not imply that women rise above men, but that men and women are equal. You must admit that in terms of capabilities, the two sexes are much more alike than unalike. Therefore, our rights should be the same. And as you know, hard work and dedication cannot be proven at birth. So why then should people be unequal to begin with? There is no logic to your reasoning, only greed. Here, you can admit that all you want is to preserve power for the ruling class. See, you've gone as far as to contradict yourself. If people were treated equally based on their hard work and not their fortuitous wealth, your class, the ruling class, would be outvoted by the hard-working peasants that you so maliciously overpower.
Ridiculous! Some people are born with talents. Not necessarily, peasants are not really born with much talent. Those who are born with this talent deserve more power, and most of them are not and do not use this.
Look how desperate you are to defend your power. Or rather, excuse me, your non-existent power, because, may I remind you, we're all dead. Anyways, first you claim that equal treatment of people should be based on their hard work, and now, realizing that what you said could affect your rank, you say that equal treatment of people should be based on their talent? Some people would advise you to be less of a hypocrite, or at least one that makes their hypocrisy less obvious. But I don't mind at all that you've exposed yourself. It means less work for me.
Yes, Marcus. People should be whatever they want without discrimination against them. It is good to work hard and be dedicated. But Peter, if you attempt to push against them and to spoil their lives, they might not appreciate you and turn the tables, beginning to think of you as less than their equal, sitting in a throne with no right to govern.
Even though some may rise to a higher power through their talent or merit, this talk of political equality is absurd. The vast majority cannot rule themselves. That would lead to chaos. They need a strong and talented, God-given ruler.
Since you are human, last time I checked, temporarily resurrected for merely the purpose of this feast, you must feel at least some remorse knowing that your class, the ruling class, has been the world's greatest purveyor of oppression. Or perhaps not. Perhaps you were the victim of your own power, blind to the fact that your rule caused millions to suffer.
Marx, you misunderstand. Our role as rulers is not to make people suffer, but to guide them as God has guided us. After all, we are His representatives on earth.
It is good to finally hear from someone who understands the true divine right of monarchs.
Indeed, it is relief to hear someone talk sense. As you said, Sir Peter, absolutism is the only way to govern, isn't it?
Yes, of course. How can a country go around getting anything done if a couple of hundred of people are arguing about what institutions to put into place? What a headache.
I have no respect for any dictators like you Russian czars. You're all the same. You let the people live in poverty, allow master-servant relations, and abuse your power. Have you been wise and generous enough to give up power and spread your wealth amongst the oppressed? I might have some respect for you, but you wouldn't be a czar then, would you? In my opinion, the only way to go is to eliminate the government completely.
I hate anarchists. It can be argued that anarchism was the initial cause of the Russian Revolution. Anarchists assassinated my grandfather because he freed the serfs and tried to reform Russia. Due to that incident, my father and I, as Tsars, tried to repress revolutions, but the infection they spread in the end led to the Russian Revolution in 1917.
We anarchists only killed your grandfather because he was trying to reform from the top, making true reform impossible, and leaving his subjects content with the dictatorship. The assassination of your grandfather clearly worked as it was supposed to, except that the Russian Revolution was an utter failure that led to yet another dictatorship.
Anarchism and communism will always end in a dictatorship. When Parliament defeated me, Oliver Cromwell took all of the power that was meant to belong to the monarchy and became a cruel, heartless dictator, lacking any sort of morals. Because of this, I believe that people cannot rule themselves, needing a wise ruler to rule over them. So I can agree with my father-in-law, King James, when he says that people should not meddle with such ancient rights of his as he has received from his predecessors, possessing them as ancestral customs.
With all due respect, Henrietta, I think you've ascended much too high on your tower of power. to realize the world's genuine need for socialism and eventually communism. Communism is a system of social organization that has never truly been tried, and these days never truly explained. True communism, as I have defined it, is a society wherein all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid according to their abilities and their needs, allowing for progress. You see, I came to realize the need for communism after realizing that the history of all previous societies has been a history of class struggles. In nearly every society, the lower class has been subject to and oppressed by the ruling class, causing for dysfunctional tension between the classes. And while some cases have been worse than others, I found myself wondering whether our world must go on this way. On both a political, economic, and social level, I believe communism would improve our society and rid us of capitalism, with all its problems, including those of social and cultural division.
You're wrong, Marx. Only attempted socialism and communism ends in a dictatorship. Lenin attempted to reform Russia directly from the top as well, which is not what the revolution is about. The revolution should come from the majority demanding their rights, not from one man declaring a communist revolution. Anarchism is about the complete elimination of government. Dictatorships cannot arise without a government to support them in the first place. And to address your ideas, Henrietta Maria, about inheriting the throne, that exact concept of ancestry is what keeps the classes divided and numb.
Seems I must inform both of you of some truth. Communism cannot be had anywhere without socialism laying its foundation. Yes, sadly, communism has been terribly misunderstood because of the sick dictators who call themselves communists. But they were not even remotely following the blueprint to socialism, let alone communism. You want to know what blueprint they followed? They followed the grim blueprint to totalitarianism. Rulers like Pol Pot, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao's misalignment with the term communism has tarnished the term in the eyes of far too many, and it sickens me that even today we call those rulers communists. We should never have begun calling them communists, despite what they called themselves. We should call them for what they were, tyrants. Socialism, which is the necessary step before communism, advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be collectively regulated by the community. And more recently, certain aspects of socialism have been attained. People like BenGurion, for example, give me hope. And while he might not have been a communist, he certainly nurtured the birth of Israel with socialism.
Marx is right, Goldman. You're only taking into consideration the horribly failed attempts at socialism. I founded Israel with socialism in mind, and Israel hasn't become a dictatorship.
And to speak on your support of anarchism, Goldman, you must remember that our versions of traditional anarchism and traditional communism aspire to reach the same end goal. That is, for a collective class consciousness to be universally obtained so that a classless society may be achieved. But the way in which anarchism and communism differ is that anarchism wants those changes to be made immediately and is not patient enough to wait for progressive change, as communism advises via socialism. What do you expect for a society centered around a classless, or around a class hierarchy to suddenly turn into a classless society off of one revolution?
The only way to make change is through immediate action, Marx. Israel may one day become a true communist society, but not until anarchists come down and blow the place up. I am not entirely sure what I was expecting of the Russian Revolution, but it was certainly not a dictatorship. I admit I was wrong in that regard, but not entirely. I still do believe it is possible for a true anarcho-communist revolution to come out of a feudal society, but definitely not in the fashion the Russians brought it about, that is to say, from the top down.
What a disgusting conversation this has been. It makes me laugh that Marx, Goldman, and BenGurion have overlooked divine right. Don't you know that God put me in power, and only God have the right to remove me? As Henrietta Maria's father-in-law, King James said, the people need a father figure to look after them, or as the SARS was called, a little father. Only a strong ruler can bring order out of chaos.
No one can talk to God. How can you claim that he chose you? He would not choose one person to rule over everyone, because we are all equal under him.
I think that you were incorrect. Of course God chooses us to rule. You only say this because he didn't give you the privilege of rule over others.
Just like how Britain had no moral control over India, a nation capable of governing itself, none of you rulers have the right right to forcefully impose your ideas on other people who can think perfectly well from themselves.
Yes, I agree, because these rulers took part in unnecessary conflicts, forced their ideas onto other people, and caused many deaths. Yet, I believe that they have the right to the power, so it is their decision as to what they want to do with it.
As I keep saying, peasants are not people. I do have the right to impose my ways on them because because not only am I more educated and know what's best for them, but I am also the God-given ruler.
You are wrong when you say that they aren't people. A ruler should use his divine right properly and respect his people's needs, no matter how poor they are.
I agree with you, Frederick. Besides, BenGurion, you're like one of those radical Jews who so disrupted Russia. Like my tutor once said, 1/3 of the Jews must die, 1/3 must immigrate, and 1/3 must convert to Christianity. Rather than joining the revolution, they are the ones behind the destruction of Russia.
That's terrible. How could you say such a thing, much less carry out such slaughter and discrimination? You ought to let them be free to believe what they wish, and not emulate the Nazis with their terrible genocide.
This unfortunate thinking has penetrated throughout history. It is impossible to argue with such ingrained anti-Semitism. As one of my greatest influences, Theodore Herzl, once said, old prejudices all against us still lie deep within the hearts of people. Right after choosing to pioneer in Palestine, I had to run from Nicholas's highly anti-Semitic Russian police. Jewish communities even had to set up their own courts because the Russian ones wouldn't help them.
How dreadful, especially considering how tolerant Poland had been of them before Russia took it over. Indeed, all people should be free to discover what they believe in, and not be forced into believing something that they have not researched to a point that they feel suitable.
I am unable to see what the problem is in pushing a religion onto other people, especially those who are younger.
People should have the freedom to decide. I believe the best way to decide is by studying and choosing what makes sense to you.
But if someone is too young or naive to be able to fully understand religion, then there is no problem showing them the beauty of what you believe.
I agree. Especially as a ruler, it is the duty of any man to show the world what the correct beliefs are.
Then yes, as you say, Henrietta, you may introduce others to your ideas. This will then build a foundation for them to study from.
Well, I'm glad that we can agree on this, because some people don't see the sense in this, and I don't see how. I will never be able to understand how my attempt to convert my youngest son, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, to Roman Catholicism alienated me from my eldest son, Prince Charles.
Indeed, religion should not be forced upon someone. It should be only to enlighten oneself and to keep yourself righteous. In addition, everyone in the church should be treated equally. I tried to show this with my design of St. Paul's. I had an open space underneath the dome for all people to worship together without hierarchical order. The priests objected, however, because of their traditional views of having people ranked according to their importance. They also liked a long nave for processions, so I had to appease them by including it in the plan.
I agree with you, Mr. Wren, that religion should be used to enlighten oneself, and that everyone within their religion should be treated equally. The same goes for those with different religions from oneself. Religious toleration is necessary. I certainly experienced intolerance when I was officially excluded from any official participation in the coronation ceremony. I was not crowned as Queen of England because the English could not accept a Roman Catholic.
Living in Asia, I learned that there are influences in the religions of the East to render their followers wiser, nobler, purer, and purer. So yes, equality should be extended to all religions, including the Oriental religions.
That's exactly what I mean, Miss Lenois. No one person would be able to control God. There is no one holy enough to compare to God in his greatness. And yet, you have a high priest who claims to control the whole religion.
I am not very knowledgeable about Oriental religions, and I was mostly speaking about within the branches of Christianity, but I have no objections, Mrs. Leonons. to what you were suggesting?
Sadly, Your Majesty, the intolerance you experienced in England was just the sort of attitude that contributed to such conflicts as the 30 Years' War. A clash that started as a disagreement between Protestants and Catholics, and that turned the many kingdoms of Germany into a horrific battlefield from 1618 to 1648. In the end, I think the real fight was about power, not beliefs, which were used as an excuse to attack and invade. Even I was drawn in as an advisor to one of the Catholic generals.
In spite of your feelings to the contrary, Kepler, war is a necessity for the progression of any country. It is the fast, effective, and the most worthy way to grow.
I agree with you, although it is important not to forget the negative effects it can have as well.
Yeah, that's why you have to win, or else you have many other problems.
Of course, there are always destructive consequences, fool. I'm one of the best military generals ever to live.
Best general ever to live. You are lucky my grandson switched sides and joined you in the 7 Years' War, or you had been killed and Prussia annihilated. He was a foolish boy to save your life, but at least he wasn't Nicholas II.
As much as I admire you, Peter, your way to rule an empire may have worked back then, but technology has advanced, and you have become out of date.
That doesn't give you an excuse for your worse than poor performance in the Russo-Japanese War and in World War I. You are a disgrace to the military power of Russia. I, on the other hand, actually succeeded in the Great Northern War and the Ottoman-Russian Wars. You could learn a thing or two by watching me, and so could you, Frederick.
What are you talking about?
The only thing that saved you was the untimely death of my daughter, Empress Elizabeth, and Russia switching sides when my idiot grandson, Peter III, took the throne.
No general would have been able to escape that situation without outside help. I was completely surrounded by enemies, and none of my allies could help. Your grandson did a great thing that day, and I'm forever grateful for his kindness.
Yeah, well, my grandson is an idiot. He undermined all of Russia's interests to help you.
I believe all these wars you speak of are entirely unnecessary and should be eradicated. In fact, I had some ideas about how to do so.
That's ridiculous. War will never be solved. How could you think to do it?
Not only is it ridiculous, but it's ungrateful. One of the main reasons I led Russia into the disastrous World War I was to defend our Slavic brothers in Serbia from the attacks of Austria-Hungary. Aren't you glad we protected your native land from those barbarians?
Perhaps I shouldn't be, but that war was a calamity for the entire world, not just Russia.
In the end, I suppose you are right. Russia certainly never recovered from it. Not only did I lose my throne and my life, but the motherland was ruined by the revolution that seized power.
That is an understatement. But the fault was yours as much as any. Sorry, Nicholas. You insisted on leading in war when that was not your talent, and in listening to the advice of that mystic peasant Rasputin.
You are mistaken, Frederick. I actually wanted to try a diplomatic solution at first, and get Austria to talk over the problem at The Hague, but they wouldn't listen. And events were moving too quickly. Germany backed Austria and wanted to crush France. Suddenly, before turning on Russia, we had to act.
Absurd! Supporting Serbia was as foolish as your alliance with France. You should have benefited from Germany instead of importing their experts as I did. When you could have defeated Japan and the Turks and kept your throne.
All this is beside the point. We must end war altogether. I have invented a deterrent that all nations could use. My apparatus projects particles which may be relatively large or of microscopic dimensions, enabling us to convey to a small area at a great distance trillions of times more energy than is possible with rays of any kind. Many thousands of horsepower can be thus transmitted by a stream thinner than a single hair, so that nothing can resist. A nation could destroy anything approaching within 200 miles, and it will provide a wall of power in order to make any country, large or small, impregnable against armies, airplanes, and other means for attack.
I understand that something like that called Star Wars was proposed by the American government in the 1980s, and that they have been working on it without much success since then. I think there are better ways than more weapons for solving conflict.
Perhaps you are right. but it is still true that advancements in science and technology are the most efficient way to progress.
I think that this idea is rather foolish. Well, I think it might be nice not to have soldiers out in the field. War begets virtues such as resolution, mercy, greatness of soul, generosity, and charity. With your idea, there would be no glory left in war.
Why must there be glory in war? The war is fought and is either won or lost, so glory doesn't really matter.
I agree with Tesla. I would have much preferred my scientific efforts put towards creating something good for the good of the country instead of on weapons of war.
Well, I agree that science is a good way to develop a country. War is far more effective and necessary in gaining political status, and obviously superior.
As much as it pains me to disagree with their magnanimous at the fates, the only thing that war is effective at is destroying our humanity. If you really wanted to gain power and influence, you would have done so without killing your fellow man.
Von Braun, I'm not sure you had any humanity in the first place. Were you a Nazi?
Look, just because I lived in Germany at the time, and made the V-2 missile, and wore a swastika pin, and signed up with the National Socialist German Workers' Party.
Which was the Nazi party.
Look, I don't support the Nazis.
Sure, excluding all those incidents and all others that you don't mention or are still denying. Maybe you weren't a Nazi.
I simply cannot believe you would be so rude, callous, and
right,
uncultured that you would repudiate my arguments in such a simple manner.
You say this in spite of your Nazi ties and anti-Semitic, slave-owning, oppressionist baggage following you around. It is amazing how you can still attempt to refute these facts.
Listen here, you disgusting little... Look, I sincerely hope our Russian guests will be more civilized than you are.
Same to you, Von Braun. Same to you.
Von Braun, you can see very well. Russians are a particularly civilized people. Of course, even among us, there are exceptions. My fellow Tsar, Nicholas, he is an example of a disgrace to the motherland. How could you put Russia into such a position? How could you dishonor the Russian name?
Thanks, Peter the Great. Although I would not personally call a man who tortures and kills his own son the Great. Perhaps instead the murderer?
Murder? He was a traitor. He wanted to overthrow me and see our country back to barbarism. Come here so I can wring your neck. After I am done with you, I will have all of Russia fill you with lead.
Too bad Russia's not yours anymore.
Russia's still mine. I live on with the name Emperor of all the Russias. The Russian people would fall to my knees like dogs before they even noticed you.
On the contrary, at least I was canonized. I live on forever inside the gates of heaven.
A saint executed by his own people.
Hey, shut up!
Let's stop this argument, if only for the sake of civility. Just keep eyes in the back of your head.
I hate to take sides on this, but I'll have to say that I disapprove of Nicholas II seeming to lead to violence in unnecessary wars. A monarch is meant to lead their people through hard times, not throw them into it in the most violent way possible.
As I said earlier, Henrietta Maria, I did not leap into war. It was forced on me, and we even did beat Russia several times. But too many complexities made organizing it nearly impossible. The trains never seemed to get boots and ammunition to the soldiers at the right time and place. And even though there was a big harvest, the food never reached the starving workers in the cities. But I don't see that you did much either during the English Civil War. I bet fleeing to Paris and letting the people fight each other really did help them, huh?
I was going away to gain foreign aid, and I was somewhat successful at the beginning. I traveled to Holland and France in an effort to gain arms, men, and money for my husband's cause. That's more than I can say for you.
Yes, you, Nicholas, out of everyone, should not be talking about failure of any type.
Peter, have you ever learned not to interrupt a conversation? And as for you, Henrietta, you returned 2 years later when the war was ending.
Do forgive me. I didn't realize that this was supposed to be a lecture on my life story. Maybe someone is just trying to cover up their own failures.
I do not disagree that I failed the Russians, but I took the responsibility to lead my army when my commanders were losing, and the ministers running the government seemed incompetent. Even when I abdicated, the Duma, the new government, didn't do any better at war.
It's just like you to start acting like the victim. We're the last emperor of Russia simply because we're vicious, yet in power.
How can you say that? The evil communist revolution was a disaster beyond my control. It overthrew all order, tradition, and religion, and led not only to the assassination of my dear family, but to the ruin of poor Mother Russia. It went too far and destroyed all that we Tsars have been building.
As I said earlier in this conversation, Nicholas, the Russian Revolution was a disaster because it didn't go far enough. I was really excited about it at first, until I saw for myself its true results and became disillusioned by it. It showed that even socialist and communist governments lose their ideals and simply end in tyranny, corruption, and totalitarianism. The Russian masses, I was told, were exhausted by hunger and cowed by terrorism. Moreover, they had lost faith in all parties and ideas. What is needed is not control from the top, but pure democracy, that is, anarchism, with participation by all in important decisions and actions.
You're right, Fräulein Goldman. About the Russian Revolution, at least. It was a failure. And yes, everyone should participate in government. But that is what true communism leads to. These dictatorships, such as Stalin's and Mao's, that seized power in the name of people are a distortion of my ideas and led to totalitarianism, as you said, not true communism, or even socialism. As I said before, call them for what they were, tyrants. Oh, and their citizens would benefit from this communism? From having their more privileged members knocked down into oblivion?
Oblivion? What makes you delusional enough to interpret good-natured class consciousness, communism, as oblivion? When you say oblivion, you must be talking about your own.
Oh, not at all. I speak of communism, which forces anyone and everyone to live in poverty and wretchedness. Or did you somehow miss that when you were squatting in a wretched trash can?
How your humor delights me. But everyone here knows that your false confidence is hiding behind a capitalist's worst fear. The fear of losing power at the hands of the proletariat.
Let's take this outside, like gentlemen.
So, Anna, I heard you were a teacher.
Yes, I was. As I said, I taught the royal children of Siam. But before that, I had a small schoolhouse in Singapore where I taught the army children. When I lived in America, I opened a small school for stores. So yes, I am familiar with education.
That is good. Education, especially for children, is the best way to further ourselves with our knowledge of God and His creations.
I agree. Are you finished, gentlemen?
Indeed. It's nice to talk to someone in such a civilized and honest manner.
The matter of educational debate.
Well, moving on and letting tensions cool down a bit, we have many curious people that would like to ask us some questions. Let's give this some time to do this, shall we? Questions, anyone? We now open the audience. Young man with glasses.
I have a question for Baron Braun.
Yes?
How were you related to NASA?
Oh, I was one of the people who helped create the National Aeronautics and Space Administration.
NASA.
One of the people who helped create the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and was one of its original members. It was originally created during the Cold War to help with the space travel and experimentation. I was also firmly in power of the agency when I helped people get onto the moon. However, after a while, we began to have disagreements about what we should be focusing on. I wanted to push space travel farther and faster than the rest of us do. I didn't leave it for too long.
Okay, more questions. questions then? Yes.
Despite your obvious disagreements on some points, I see a fairly strong strain of intellectual imperatives among time between many of you. We have scientists, we have military leaders, we have feminists. If you could just briefly, each of you tell me, which of your compatriots on the panel do you most admire? Starting with Newton?
That would definitely be Nicola. I'm just kidding.
I admire Peter I for his military prowess.
I admire Newton for his preliminary mathematical discoveries.
Yes, I as well. I admire Newton. He is an inspiration to this.
Yeah, after they all insulted me, I don't really like any of them. I like just myself.
I'd say Miss Goldman is a lovely woman. You know, she's a very powerful woman, I will say. And Henrietta too.
I'd say Mr. Newton for taking my ideas and furthering them in optics and gravitation.
I would say that Goldman is not that bad after all, even though she was an anarchist. And that is definitely not communism. I would say Newton, without his pioneering research into space travel, I would have never been able to do any of my feats.
Kepler for his advanced thinking during his time.
I'd have to say Mrs. Leonowens for her involvement with feminism.
I would have to say, in terms of my ideas on equality, Mrs. Leonowens. However, I must admire Nicola Tesla.
Definitely Marx, as his ideas were the foundation for some of the things I believe.
I'm also going to have to go with Marx, even though he doesn't exactly know what he's doing, in my opinion.
Actually,
More questions? Hands.
You.
Sir Isaac Newton, have you ever loved?
No, usually disrupt the scientific progression.
Anna, do you have any funny stories to tell from Siam?
I do. So when His Majesty's anger was strong enough, when the women's violation, for instance his consorts, was considered offensive enough, he could lead to lash or even confinement in chains. Yet it was Lady Taeyong, according to my accounts, who involved this harmless ploy of trying to distract Mongkut from his anger at one of his concerts by sending me to ask him questions about scholarship or translation.
Yes.
Sir Nicola Tesla, what did you make something sexual
I did what I did because money does not represent such a value as men have placed upon it. All my money has been invested to experiments with which I have made new discoveries enabling mankind to live a little easier life. As with the second question, I had become intensely interested in electricity under the stimulating influence of my professor of physics, who was an ingenious man and often demonstrated the principles of his apparatus by his own invention.
Yes.
Anna, Henrietta, and Emma, given that it's I don't know if you're aware of recent events in the Me Too movement, but do each of you feel optimistic about women ever achieving true equality in civilization?
I do. I believe that women work very hard, so as I have. So yes, I believe so.
I'd say that I too feel optimistic about women gaining more power and being able to be more involved in what men used to dominate, like how I was able to help Charles back then. I feel like I'd be able to do more now and even more in the future.
Yes, but not until the anarchist revolution.
Yes, far back.
I believe you're all very fortunate that you could come back from the dead. You also, I can see that you all have strong opinions about your lives and but at the same time, it seems like you're all preaching in your time. So a question for, in general, is now that you see other characters from other time periods, would you be willing to change some of your own strong opinions of the time you lived in?
Well, I would say that I've always been a strong believer in my beliefs, but I oftentimes learned from my comrades in Paris when I lived there. There were so many different socialist thinkers that challenged my beliefs and furthered the notion of communism with me. So I cannot only say that I was the father of communism, because saying that would not attribute to all of the hard work that comrades put in. So that's all I have to say on that.
I have something to say. I think I've always been adaptable, and if this new century of people provides anything with solid foundation of scientific belief, I'm inclined to believe anything that can that can have good proof behind it and will make sense to the science I can understand.
Indeed, I too, if others were to propose rational, concrete ideas, I too would believe them. Unfortunately, I don't think anyone here is able to present those ideas, especially those that make slanderous, unfounded accusations about things that may not have happened.
Okay, young sir in the back right.
So this is for Karl Marx, and also one Braun. Who won?
That's open to debate. You might want to come back for some other events to talk about that with us. Any other questions? You done there?
I have a question for Nicola Tesla. How do you feel about Thomas Edison stealing meridians?
Well, he was using them to improve the technology, so I let him.
Yes, right here.
Question for Peter the Great. Why did you build St. Petersburg?
Yes, St. Petersburg, my pride and glory. Let's see here. Ever since I was a child, I was drawn to, my memory is a little fuzzy. I built St. Petersburg for two reasons. First was because I wanted a place to call paradise. It was a place where I could go where I felt most at home. The second was to show everyone in the world my position, my passion for the West. It housed everything I had worked for, and it was built on the Baltic for that reason. It was a symbol of the center and my reformed Russia. I made every nobleman I could come with his family, regardless of what business he had in his hometown. The educated needed to learn from my example, and St. Petersburg was a convenient place to expose the new generation of the upper class to the glory of Western Russia.
Yes.
How does Anna feel about the betrayal in The King and I?
I will say I am delighted with my resurrection as a well-born and gently bred English lady of Margaret Landing's book. Although I am less delighted with the values Margaret had resurrected me as. These are such as portraying me as a proselytizing Christian and not emphasizing the importance of equality.
You're very far back there.
For Emma Goldman, if you were in charge of the whole Russian Communist Revolution, what would you have done to make it work out? I would have killed pretty much anyone who dared rise to power, although I couldn't really be in charge of the revolution because that is not the purpose of the revolution. It's just about the workers rising up. I would for sure make speeches, but in the end, it's about everyone coming together just to be without government. So if any form of government arose, I would kill them.
You know, I gotta say, I do like the second part of that more than the first part.
Yes, back here. Oh, sure.
Oh, for King Frederick. Can you tell us more about your relationship with Voltaire and kind of how you reconcile those ideas of France with your role as a military leader?
Voltaire and I were great friends for most of his life. I have admired him since my youth, and we exchanged many letters consisting of conversations about philosophy, politics, and literature. Since I preferred to write my literary works in French, he was also my editor, and I, in turn, helped him with the politics side of it.
Barback?
Starting with Mr. Marks, but any of you can answer this as well. What regrets do you have?
I have plenty of regrets. Not so much in terms of my work, because I was so devoted, and I spent so much time doing what I believed was right. But I do have regrets in terms of my family. I think when I was reading my bio, I mentioned that I lost several children due to the poverty that my family underwent. And for that, I am extremely regretful that my vocation could not support my family. I spent many days and nights mourning over my children, and I still do, somewhere.
I regret not being able to make it to Mars in my lifetime. Ever since I was young, it was the dream I always had and always wanted to fulfill. But the fact that, and I tried hard, I wrote a book about it. But the fact that I was unable to do it haunts me.
I really wish I had more time to further develop my interests and come up with my work.
I don't have very many regrets, but the one major regret I can think of was not spending enough time with my beloved Charles before he died. I was so involved in helping with the English Civil War that I didn't realize that I could lose him so quickly.
I regret not having more time to further my research into the topics of especially thinking machines, what you would now call computers. And I would say that I definitely regret not being a larger advocate for equality for all.
Well, I definitely wish I could have saved more people and not let the death toll be so big during World War II. I doubt I could have really done anything, as you can't really convince a person that they're going to die. But I still wish something could have been different.
I regret getting married and not leaving my family sooner.
I would say the biggest regret for me is wasting my time in so many fields. Now that I see the current technology and what everyone knows, I realize that I wasted so much time messing around with platonic solids and how they fitted with the planets, in the harmony of the spheres in which all music is tied to every planet. It seems so silly now, and I wish I could have spent more time finding out about the power of God and how I could use that to help humanity.
I kind of regret not being able to see my little son, Alexei, grow up to become a Tsar, because he's my favorite. And also, coming here, I now have self-esteem.
I regret not doing enough for Russia. I wish when I died, Russia was still a highly feudalistic society, and I wish I could have done more to make these weak peasants into middle-class strong men.
I don't have very many regrets, although something that should be considered a regret is letting people use my patents without my consent, because I was kind of living in poverty towards the end of my life, and they were extremely wealthy.
I regret having tried to run away when I was 18, because it resulted in the death of my best friend, and it was probably the reason that I was forced to marry.
As I directly quote the WA commercial, no regrets.
Yes, sir.
Yes, this is for Alan Turing and Nicola Tesla.
I was wondering if you feel that the modern information age that your work has ushered in will be positive for equality and for bringing people together, or will be divisive and drive people apart?
Well, I would say that the information age is a double-sided sword. It both allows communication throughout the world, but it also is a way to spread negative ideas. So I would say that we just need to be careful with what we do with it. We need to make sure that we not only have control over these negative ideals that may hurt people in the actual world, but we must make sure that this new way of communication is not abused.
I think eventually it will lead to peace because it allows for easier communication between nations, and because of that, it makes it easier for things like negotiations to happen.
Yes, sir, right in the middle.
This is a question for Nicola Tesla. What do you think of the company that currently bears your name? And what is your favorite model car that they produce?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Karl Marx. Historically, the American colonies have been looked on as one of the more pure experiments in communism, where people would take care of one another. And leadership would be chosen from within. And that leadership was still part of the populace. What's your impression of how that turned out?
That sounds like what I would have wanted for more societies to have adopted. I am not familiar with the particular circumstances that you brought up, but based on what you said and what you described from it, seems like what I would have wanted for, like I said, more societies to have adopted. It's essentially what communism was to me.
Okay, back corner. No duplicates. Maybe some.
Peter, the questionably great. Why did you kill your son?
Yes, well, I mean, I would have done, if you were my son, I would have killed you too. It was because it had to be done. When he was coming of age to rule after me, he hated what I had done for Russia, and for this reason, he gravitated towards those who conspired against me, and soon he ran away from home. This was a disgrace to my image to have such a fool tied to the royal family of Russia. So I gave him a chance to come back home, and I said I had forgiven him, and it was all in the past. The stupid boy complied, and as soon as he came home, I tortured him and killed him. Right here.
Mr. BenGurion, can you tell me how you feel about the conflict with Palestine?
The Palestinians should be treated like any other person living in Israel. We must start working in Jaffa. Jaffa must employ Arab workers, and there is a question of their wages. I believe they should receive the same wages as Jewish workers. An Arab has also the right to be elected president of the state, should he be elected by all. However, this conflict is incredibly ingrained. I do not think a solution exists. If one does, I would think it would be founded by communication on both sides.
Yes, right here.
Peter, you win the Baghdad Good Year Award, but I'm wondering who else has children and how do you feel about your children? Starting with whoever.
Well, I had many children. Many of them died very quickly. Only 3 of them made it past childhood, and only 1 of them was still alive by the time I died. I love them all dearly. I just wish they could have been around more so I could teach them the ways of God and science.
May I go? The answer to your question for me is very personal because, like I said, I lost my children at very young ages. But my oldest, that managed to live the longest, had an imagination that reminded me of the imagination that I started with in regards to communism. And I'm not simply trying to tie the 2 together for the sake of tying the 2 together. This genuinely reminded me of my imagination and showed me that, like this man over here was saying, that it is quite possible to achieve a society like that, where people can work together, can be, positive with one another in order to meet each other's needs just as they should. And that made me think, the imagination of my one child that lived to 9 years old made me think of that imagination for positive and optimistic change.
I, too, as I said, Avis and Louis. Louis was the younger one, Avis was my older one. When I went to Siam, I had to leave Avis in boarding school, and I wrote to her so much. I gave her parental advice, and we talked about how much we missed each other. I was so excited to see her again, and same with Louis. We were very close, and this was because I lost 2 children of my own when I was much younger, and it was heartbreaking, and so I love my children very much.
I had 5 or 6 children. I forget. I had one son, Alexei. He was supposed to be the next Tsar, but we all died. So yeah.
Dogs are better, and I didn't have a dog.
Okay, more questions. Yes.
A question for Nicola Tesla. How is your name connected to the vehicle that's flying through space?
What?
Yes.
I have a question for Christopher Wren. What did you do after the Great London Fire?
After the fire, I helped create a new layout for the city. Unfortunately, the plans were not accepted due to financing. However, they had 50 more churches, my most famous being St. Paul's Cathedral. I also submitted a general process for rebuilding the city. I was knighted in 1673 for my work under King Charles II. This honor was bestowed upon me after my resignation from the Slavian chair in Oxford.
Thank you.
Yes, over here.
Mine is for Anna. What is your specialty?
Oh, my last name. Well, there's not really much of a story. So my husband's full name was Thomas Louis Leon Owens, but when he died, another way of me changing my story was I took on the last name Leon Owens because he liked that better, and so it kind of stuck.
Back in the corner.
I have a question for Alan Turing. I read about your thought experiment of machines, computer machines, and that if a subject could not tell the difference between the 2 answers, one was a person and another one was a machine, that you could think that a machine had consciousness. Now that you see how computers have evolved, do you think that machines, computers, or artificial intelligence really could eventually achieve consciousness like we have, or surpass what we do?
I do believe that they could achieve consciousness and actually surpass us, in that as long as they have enough power and enough memory, they would be able to absorb potentially forever. And seeing as machines, unless tampered with, are practically immortal, they would have much more time than a human to absorb all of this information, and assuming they had the same intelligence, as a human or greater, they would be able to, well, do almost anything. We wouldn't be able to comprehend.
So do you think that's promising for us or a threat to us?
I think it's both promising and something that we need to be careful of. Because, well, if a machine had greater intelligence than us, but we did not respect it as we have in the past and still do, sadly, not respect our fellow human, we would definitely have them, well, not necessarily violently push back, but they would push back. And I think that if we can just make sure that we stay on top of the issue, we will be able to live in harmony with this potential idea of artificial intelligence.
I think we just have time for a couple more questions.
Actually, okay, we'll give it one more. Okay, yeah. Yes, with the strange hair. What are the kids doing these days?
Actually, lately the kids have been protesting gun violence through walkouts during school times. What are your opinions on guns and gun violence?
I regret asking you. As you said, there have been some debates about this recently, and I'd rather not offend anyone by making any comments on that, so we're just gonna move on to the last question now. So, one more question? Good? Mm-hmm. Cool.
Actually, may we have the final question? Why? Well, actually,
We wanted to ask you a question, Braun.
I don't know what you're talking about.
You have seemed a bit aggressive this evening.
On top of that, Death seems to have given you quite a superiority complex.
And you did punch marks.
Yeah, but you're a really good fighter. I thought you were an engineer, but it seems I was mistaken.
And so, our question is,
who are you?
You clever fools! You think you can stand against me? It is almost pitiable that you think you can even inconvenience me. While you all have been talking about your topics, I have been planning, for I am not Werner von Braun, but Klaus, the Butcher of Lyon! Yes, Klaus, Butcher and Master of Lyon, a member of the SS, and I'm hired to clamp down on Marxian ideals. How horrible! When I died, I knew someone would hold a gathering of this sort. Necromancy is an ancient art, and I knew even then I could use it to my advantage. When I knew you would target von Braun, I had my followers swap the bodies, so you would resurrect me instead. I spent the past week carefully studying his ideals and beliefs, so that when the time came, I could accurately portray them. I may not have accurately depicted his personality, but no matter! When the time has come, I shall take my followers and take over the world! I shall rise again! That's where you're wrong! Do you think you can stop me? So it's pretty well.
Yes, because very little do you know, we have a very secret weapon.
We three have known that you would choose this night as the night of your return. Armed with this knowledge and our secret weapon, we had devised a plan.
Marx would draw you into conflict so that he could leave for a moment without looking suspicious. From there, he would go and retrieve our secret weapon.
And then we would stall for enough time so that the secret weapon would be ready.
Oh, and what is this secret weapon? I assure you, it won't be strong enough to stop me.
It is, for the secret weapon is
time! What are you doing? You're never so long. Your time is up.
What? No! Well, we've made history tonight at our history feast. And it wouldn't have been possible without our lovely audience.
Again, thank you, Kale, who organized this whole event. And again, thank you so much to the History Night coordinators, David and Julia Rule. Thank you to the feast assistants, Stella and Carrie Portis, Caroline Gray, Monica Horn, and Lakshmi and Nanda Vinyu. To Jean Chivard, who helped set up the lights and capturing this event, and of course to Leslie Howells, who made these wonderful programs and name tags. Thank you to all the families who helped contribute to this grant.
Thank you again for coming. If you would please help us clean up the tables and throw away garbage and everything, that would be lovely. Thank you so much. Your attendance is very much appreciated. Farewell and thank you.